If you walked into the diner on the corner of 4th and Main back in the spring of 1994, you would have heard the exact same joke being told at least 3 times a day. The joke always started with Abigail Vance, and it always ended with a laugh. Abigail was 72 years old, stood barely 5 feet tall, and owned a 3-acre patch of dirt right on the ragged eastern edge of Oakhaven. To the local corn conglomerates and the third-generation cattlemen who ran the county, 3 acres wasn't a farm, it was a backyard garden with delusions of grandeur. They called it Abigail's postage stamp. They laughed when she spent her mornings hand-tilling the soil, and they laughed harder when she refused to buy heavy machinery, preferring an old, squeaking wheelbarrow and a rusted spade. Oakhaven was a town built on scale. If you weren't driving a combined harvester that cost more than a suburban home, you weren't really farming. But Abigail didn't care about scale. She cared about heritage. That tiny plot of land had been in her family since the Homestead Acts, a stubborn survivor of economic crashes, droughts, and the slow, creeping expansion of the town itself. While the rest of the county tore down their windbreaks and pushed their fences to the absolute limit to squeeze out another bushel of industrial grain, Abigail planted heirloom tomatoes, rare varieties of garlic, and rows of dense, deep-rooted clover. To the untrained eye, it looked chaotic, a messy stain on the neat, geometric grid of the valley. The local town council looked at her property taxes and saw a waste of space. The neighbors looked at her overgrown trellises and saw an eyesore. Everyone agreed that it was only a matter of time before the elements, or her own aching joints, forced her to sell out to the commercial dairy down the road. The laughter, however, completely evaporated on a Tuesday morning in late October. It didn't stop because of a change of heart, or because Abigail grew a record-breaking crop. It stopped because 3 black, pristine Lincoln Town cars drove down the dusty, unpaved gravel of County Road 12 and parked right outside Abigail's weathered wooden gate. Out of those cars stepped 6 men wearing charcoal gray suits that cost more than Abigail's entire annual harvest yield. These weren't local bankers or state agricultural inspectors. These were top-tier corporate litigators from Pacific Transnet, the largest railroad monopoly on the western seaboard. They carried leather briefcases with silver latches, held rolled-up blueprints under their arms, and walked with the absolute confidence of men who bought and sold entire towns before lunch. The townspeople watching from the highway crossing paused their tractors. The local sheriff slowed his cruiser. Within an hour, word had spread to the diner, the railroad lawyers were at the postage stamp, and they weren't there to buy heirloom tomatoes. What the town didn't know, what even Abigail hadn't fully realized until that exact moment, was that a massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure shift was happening across the country. Pacific Transnet was laying down a new high-speed freight corridor designed to connect the deep-water shipping ports of the coast directly to the manufacturing hubs of the Midwest. It was a project calculated to cut shipping times by 48 hours, saving the corporation hundreds of millions of dollars a year. For 18 months, their engineering teams had been mapping out the optimal path through the valley, acquiring thousands of acres of land via quiet, backroom deals and aggressive eminent domain threats. They had bought out the big cattle ranches, they had bypassed the state park, and they had successfully charted a straight, unbroken line across 3 states. Except for one tiny, 3-acre problem. As the lead attorney, a man named Marcus Vance, no relation to Abigail, though the shared name was a cosmic joke he didn't appreciate, stepped onto the dirt path. He didn't see an elderly woman or a charming homestead. He saw a roadblock. The blueprints in his briefcase showed that the proposed dual-track main line needed to pass directly through the northern 2 acres of Abigail's property. Without those specific acres, the tracks would have to curve sharply around a granite ridge, a detour that would require building 2 massive, structurally complex bridges over a deep ravine, adding an estimated $74 million to the construction budget and delaying the project by 2 years. Marcus assumed this would be an easy morning's work. You don't send 6 corporate lawyers to negotiate, you send them to dictate terms. He had a check in his pocket already signed by the chief financial officer, left blank so he could fill in a number that would make any rural resident pack their bags by nightfall. He expected tears, he expected awe, and he expected a quick signature on the deed of sale. He walked up to the porch where Abigail sat shelling peas into a metal bowl, cleared his throat, and offered her a sum of money that could have bought 3 of the largest farms in the county. Abigail didn't even look up from her peas. She listened to his pitch, looked at the blank check, and then did something that Marcus Vance had never experienced in his 15 years of corporate law. She smiled, shook her head, and told him the land wasn't for sale. Not for that price. Not for any price. When Marcus tried to explain the concept of eminent domain, the government's power to force the sale of private property for public use, Abigail finally set her bowl down. She reached into her pocket, pulled out an old, yellowed piece of parchment wrapped in oilskin, and laid it on the porch table. It was an original land patent signed in 1872 by President Ulysses S. Grant. But it wasn't just a standard homestead deed. It contained a highly specific, forgotten legal clause inserted by her great-grandfather, a veteran railroad surveyor who knew exactly how corporate monopolies operated. As Marcus Vance put on his reading glasses and scanned the faded ink, the color slowly drained from his face. The 6 lawyers behind him shifted uncomfortably as they realized that this tiny farm wasn't a defenseless target. It was a legal fortress. The document sitting on Abigail's weathered porch table didn't look like much, but to Marcus Vance and his legal team, it was a structural nightmare. To understand why Pacific Transnet couldn't just steamroll over Abigail's 3 acres, you have to understand a peculiar quirk of late 19th century infrastructure law. Abigail's great-grandfather, Silas Vance, hadn't just been a farmer, he had been the chief right-of-way surveyor for the old transcontinental expansion. He had seen firsthand how the early railroad barons used eminent domain to strip families of their land for pennies, only to flip that same land to commercial developers for massive fortunes. When Silas claimed his 3 acres under the Homestead Act, he utilized a rare, highly specific legal instrument known as an inalienable sovereign appurtenance reserve. In plain English, Silas had tied the land deed directly to an ancient federal charter that explicitly exempted this specific parcel from any future commercial or state-level condemnation for transportation infrastructure, provided the land remained continuously cultivated by his direct blood descendants. If the chain of cultivation was ever broken for a single growing season, the charter expired. But for 122 consecutive years, Vance had always planted, grown, and harvested on those 3 acres. Because of this, Pacific Transnet's standard legal playbook was completely useless. They couldn't use the state government to seize the land under eminent domain, because the original federal patent held absolute legal supremacy. If they wanted that dirt, they had to buy it from Abigail. And Abigail was still saying no. When word of this legal stalemate reached the Oakhaven Town Council, the reaction wasn't pride or celebration. It was absolute panic. The town council had already secretly negotiated a massive tax incentive package with Pacific Transnet to build a massive freight maintenance yard just 3 miles down the track. That yard promised to bring 400 permanent, high-paying jobs to a dying rural community, revitalizing the local economy and skyrocketing property values. The only catch was that the yard was contingent on the track running in a straight line through the valley. If Abigail forced the railroad to take the $74 million detour around the Granite Ridge, Pacific Transnet would move the entire maintenance facility 2 counties over, leaving Oakhaven to slowly rot into a ghost town. Overnight, the town that had spent decades laughing at Abigail's postage stamp turned on her with venomous intensity. The friendly nods she used to get at the grocery store disappeared, replaced by icy stares. The local paper ran an editorial subtly framing her as an eccentric, selfish old woman who was holding the future of her neighbor's children hostage over a few rows of heirloom tomatoes. Her mailbox was stuffed with anonymous, angry letters telling her to take the money and get out. Even the local diner, where her family had eaten for generations, refused to serve her coffee, claiming all the tables were reserved. But Marcus Vance wasn't relying on social pressure alone. He knew that psychological warfare was effective, but legal harassment was faster. By Thursday morning, the corporate machine went into overdrive. If they couldn't seize the land directly, they would make living on it entirely unlivable. First came the county zoning inspectors. Prompted by an anonymous tip that bore all the hallmarks of Pacific Transnet's legal research department, 3 county vehicles pulled up to Abigail's farm. They spent 4 hours meticulously examining every square inch of her property. They cited her for a vintage, non-functional water pump that supposedly violated environmental runoff codes. They issued a citation for her wooden tool shed, claiming it was constructed 4 inches too close to the property line according to a zoning law passed in 1982 that had never once been enforced in the history of the county. They even tried to fine her for agricultural blight, due to the unharvested clover she used to enrich the soil nitrogen naturally. Within 48 hours, Abigail was facing over $12,000 in administrative fines and a court order threatening to condemn her home if the violations weren't cured immediately. Abigail didn't flinch. She paid the fines using a small savings account she had kept untouched since her husband passed away, and she spent the weekend manually moving her tool shed back 4 inches with the help of a car jack and a pair of logs. Seeing that administrative bullying wasn't breaking her, Marcus escalated the tactics. On Monday, a fleet of heavy-duty earth-moving equipment owned by a subsidiary of the railroad rolled onto the property directly adjacent to Abigail's western fence line. They didn't cross her border, but they parked massive, roaring diesel generators less than 10 feet from her bedroom window. They began operating 24 hours a day, supposedly conducting preliminary seismic soil testing for the future tracks. The ground vibrated so violently that Abigail's antique china rattled in its cabinet, and the constant, deafening roar made sleep completely impossible. The vibrations also began to crack the fragile, dry stone retaining walls she had built by hand to protect her root vegetables from flooding. It was a classic corporate war of attrition: deprive her of sleep, destroy her peace, ruin her upcoming harvest, and wait for her 72-year-old body to give out under the immense stress. Marcus Vance sat in his air-conditioned trailer at the temporary construction headquarters, checking his watch, fully expecting a white flag by the end of the week. By the second week of November, Marcus Vance believed he had won. Abigail looked exhausted when she walked out to her porch, her eyes shadowed from the non-stop roar of the diesel generators. The physical toll of the corporate harassment was obvious. But Marcus had deeply miscalculated the nature of a woman who had spent 50 years tending a 3-acre plot of land. To survive as a small farmer, you have to understand ecology, patience, and systemic leverage. You don't fight a flood by standing in front of it, you dig a small trench to let the water destroy itself. And Abigail was about to dig a legal trench that would swallow Pacific Transnet's multi-billion-dollar project whole. On a rainy Wednesday morning, Abigail didn't walk to her porch to surrender. Instead, a battered old yellow school bus pulled up to her gate. Out of it stepped 12 undergraduate students and a tenured professor from the State Agricultural University's Department of Entomology and Environmental Sciences. They weren't protesters with signs, they were scientists with clipboards, magnifying glasses, and soil core samplers. Abigail had quietly spent her sleepless nights writing detailed letters to the university's research division, offering them unrestricted, permanent access to her century-old, undisturbed soil ecosystem for baseline ecological mapping. Within 4 hours of sampling, the research team found exactly what Abigail knew they would find. Because her 3 acres had been continuously cultivated using completely organic, pre-industrial methods for over 100 years, completely free of synthetic pesticides, heavy machinery compaction, or chemical fertilizers, her land had become an unintentional sanctuary. Specifically, it was the last known active breeding ground for the Bombus affinis, or the rusty-patched bumblebee, a critically endangered pollinator protected under strict federal conservation mandates. By Thursday afternoon, the university had filed an emergency biological injunction with the federal district court. The law regarding endangered species habitats near federally chartered infrastructure is absolute and incredibly unyielding. The moment an active, reproducing habitat of a critically protected species is officially confirmed, all industrial activity, heavy machinery operation, and soil disruption within a 2-mile radius must immediately cease under a mandatory 90-day environmental review period. The roaring diesel generators that had been rattling Abigail's windows were abruptly shut off by order of federal marshals. The earth-moving equipment sat silent. Every single day that Pacific Transnet's construction crews stood idle cost the corporation an estimated $380,000 in equipment leases, idle labor contracts, and supply chain penalties. Marcus Vance's flawless, linear timeline was shattered. But Abigail wasn't done. While the railroad's legal team was frantically trying to figure out how to bypass a bee habitat, she launched her second strike, targeting their financial vulnerability. Remember those 3 acres of heirloom crops the town council had called a messy eyesore? Abigail had spent decades meticulously documenting the genetic lineage of her unique garlic and tomato strains. She had them officially registered with the Heritage Seed Repository as distinct agricultural cultivars. On Friday, she filed a secondary civil lawsuit against Pacific Transnet for industrial property damage. She claimed that the violent, 24-hour vibrations from the corporate generators had disrupted the delicate subterranean root structures of her irreplaceable winter garlic crop, causing irreversible genetic degradation to a registered agricultural asset. She didn't sue for the market price of standard garlic. She sued for the projected intellectual property valuation of a unique, non-reproducible genetic strain, demanding $42 million in damages. To prove her case, she didn't hire an expensive corporate law firm. She simply utilized the state university's detailed soil and vibration data, which had already been verified by the federal marshals during the environmental halt. Suddenly, the power dynamic in the valley completely flipped. Marcus Vance was no longer the imposing corporate predator dictating terms to a helpless old woman. He was a deeply panicked executive staring at a massive, compounding financial catastrophe. The corporate board of directors in Seattle was calling his cell phone every 20 minutes, demanding to know why a 3-acre patch of dirt run by a grandmother was causing a multi-million-dollar bottleneck in their flagship national trade corridor. The town council of Oakhaven quickly realized they had backed the wrong side. The threat of the maintenance yard being cancelled loomed larger than ever, but now they realized Pacific Transnet couldn't just walk away. They were legally trapped in the valley until they settled with Abigail. The angry letters in her mailbox stopped. The local diner suddenly found an open table for her, and the town council president awkwardly showed up at her gate with a box of pastries, trying to play the role of the neutral mediator. Abigail accepted the pastries, thanked him politely, and closed the door. She knew the lawyers would be coming back to the porch very soon, and this time, they wouldn't be holding a blank check, they would be holding white flags. The sound of Marcus Vance's sleek leather shoes walking up Abigail's gravel path didn't carry the same booming authority it had just 2 weeks prior. This time, there were no secondary cars, no team of trailing junior executives, and no confident, unrolled blueprints. He walked alone under the gray, drizzling November sky, carrying nothing but a single folder. When he reached the porch steps, Abigail didn't offer him a seat, nor did she stop braiding the dried garlic husks hanging from the rafters. She simply looked at him, her expression as calm and unreadable as the soil beneath their feet. Marcus cleared his throat, the typical corporate bluster completely drained from his voice, and offered a formal settlement that would make her the wealthiest individual in the history of the county. He offered $10 million, a guarantee that her historic home would be physically relocated to any plot of land she chose in the state, and a permanent, university-funded conservation endowment to relocate the bee habitat safely. It was a staggering, astronomical offer for a 3-acre farm. But as Marcus leaned forward, expecting the sigh of relief that usually accompanies life-changing wealth, Abigail did something that caught him completely off guard. She asked him a single question, "Marcus, why this line?" Marcus paused, assuming she was asking about the geometry of the engineering tracks. He began to repeat his standard script about the granite ridge, the detour, the cost of the twin bridges over the ravine, and the efficiency of a straight line for high-speed freight delivery. But Abigail shook her head, cutting him off mid-sentence. She leaned across the table and laid down a second document, not the original homestead patent from Ulysses S. Grant, but a modern geological soil density report she had requested from the university scientists while they were mapping the endangered bumblebee habitat. The report revealed a massive anomaly. The granite ridge that Pacific Transnet claimed was a physical barrier forcing them through her farm wasn't actually solid granite all the way through. It was a massive shell of metamorphic rock covering an incredibly rare, incredibly deep deposit of lithium-bearing pegmatite, one of the largest untapped mineral reserves discovered on the continent in the last 50 years. The open loop was suddenly laid bare. Pacific Transnet wasn't just building a railroad corridor to cut shipping times by 48 hours. The railroad line was a carefully constructed legal cover. Under federal transportation layout laws, a railroad monopoly can use fast-tracked interstate authority to acquire land for transit lines, but once that land is secured under transit right-of-way, the corporate parent company retains the deep subterranean mineral rights beneath the tracks. Pacific Transnet's real objective wasn't a straight path for freight, it was to legally seize the edge of that ridge under the guise of an infrastructure emergency, allowing their mining subsidiary to quietly extract billions of dollars worth of rare earth minerals right out from under the county's feet without ever paying a single cent in mining royalties to the local community. Abigail's 3-acre farm sat directly on top of the singular structural bottleneck needed to access the deep shaft entry point of that deposit. If she sold the land under a standard railroad right-of-way deed, she wasn't just giving up her tomatoes, she was signing away the key to a corporate deception that would strip the entire valley of its natural wealth while leaving Oakhaven with a hollowed-out, toxic industrial wasteland. Marcus Vance's face went completely static. The silence on the porch became suffocating, broken only by the steady drip of rain from the eaves. He realized in an instant that this 72-year-old woman hadn't just beaten him on environmental regulations, she had exposed the multi-billion-dollar core secret of his entire corporate entity. If this information went public, it wouldn't just halt the construction in Oakhaven, it would trigger a massive federal antitrust investigation, collapse Pacific Transnet's stock price overnight, and potentially result in criminal fraud indictments for the executive board in Seattle. Marcus slowly closed his folder. The mask of the polite, negotiating corporate attorney dropped entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating desperation of a man backed into an absolute corner. He looked at Abigail, his voice dropping to a low, quiet whisper that carried a distinct, chilling edge. He told her that knowing a secret is only valuable if you live long enough to tell it to a judge. He reminded her that the county sheriff was on the corporate payroll, the state utility boards were funded by their political action committees, and an elderly woman living alone on a remote, isolated farm could easily suffer a tragic, unexpected accident before the university's environmental injunction ever made it to a formal courtroom trial. Abigail didn't flinch, nor did she look back toward the house for protection. Instead, she reached up and tapped the small, black metal button on the side of the old, weathered intercom system mounted on her porch wall, the one she used to call her husband in from the fields decades ago. What Marcus hadn't noticed was that the intercom wasn't wired to the barn anymore. A thick, modern black data cable ran from the bottom of the box, snaking along the porch railing, directly into the side of a high-powered satellite uplink dish nestled quietly inside her overgrown tomato trellises. As Marcus watched in sudden horror, a tiny green light on the intercom faceplate began to blink, indicating that every single word of his threat, his admission of the lithium deposit, and his exposure of the corporate fraud had been streamed live, in real time, to a secure server managed by the State Attorney General's Public Integrity Division and 3 major investigative news outlets. The look of absolute panic on Marcus Vance's face was something Abigail would remember for the rest of her days. Within 48 hours of that live-streamed porch conversation, the corporate empire of Pacific Transnet began to unravel at breathtaking speed. The audio recording of Marcus admitting to the hidden lithium deposit and threatening a senior citizen became the #1 trending news story across the country. By Friday morning, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice launched a joint multi-billion-dollar fraud investigation into the company's land acquisition strategies. Pacific Transnet's stock price suffered a historic 22% drop in a single trading session, wiping out billions in shareholder value before the board of directors could even draft a press release. Marcus Vance was fired by nightfall, stripped of his corporate credentials, and faced a sweeping federal grand jury indictment for conspiracy and corporate intimidation. As for the town of Oakhaven, the ultimate irony was just beginning to play out. With Pacific Transnet's fast-tracked railroad authority completely frozen by federal courts, the corporation was forced to completely abandon their deceptive mining scheme. Desperate to salvage the shipping corridor, a brand new executive team came to Abigail's porch with their hands completely open. They didn't bring threats, they brought total transparency. Abigail agreed to a settlement. But she didn't take a massive cash payout for herself. Instead, she forced Pacific Transnet to sign a binding legal covenant that completely changed the future of the valley. First, the railroad had to pay for the expensive $74 million detour around a granite ridge, leaving her 3-acre farm completely untouched. Second, the corporation was forced to pay $25 million directly into a community trust fund to build a brand new, state-of-the-art agricultural cooperative and research laboratory right in the heart of Oakhaven. The very town council members who had turned on Abigail were suddenly forced to attend a public dedication ceremony where a giant bronze statue of a worker holding a vintage wheelbarrow was unveiled on Main Street. The diner that had once refused to serve her coffee painted a massive mural of her heirloom tomatoes on their exterior wall, renaming their signature breakfast the Vance Victory Platter. Abigail, true to form, didn't attend the ceremony. She spent that afternoon exactly where she belonged, out in her fields, hand-tilling her organic soil, surrounded by the quiet, steady hum of the endangered rusty-patched bumblebees she had fought so fiercely to protect. Stories like Abigail's prove that sometimes, the smallest obstacle can completely topple the biggest corporate giants if you have the patience to find the right leverage. But it makes you wonder about the balance of power in our modern world. If you were in Abigail's shoes, would you have held out against a multi-billion-dollar corporation when they offered you a blank check, or would you have taken the life-changing money and walked away? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. I want to see how many of you are team, protect the land, versus team, take the payout. Also, what do you think happened to the massive lithium deposit under that ridge? Do you think the town will eventually find a safe way to mine it? Or should it stay buried forever to protect the valley? Let's get a debate going in the comments section. If you found Abigail's historic stand against the railroad lawyers inspiring, do me a quick favor, smash that like button right now. It takes less than a second, but it tells the algorithm that deep, high-stakes storytelling like this belongs on more people's feeds. If you want to make sure you never miss another deep dive into the world's most incredible hidden histories, legal standoffs, and underdog victories, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We have an even bigger story dropping next week involving a forgotten property loophole that cost a major bank an entire skyscraper, and you definitely don't want to miss that one. Thank you for watching, keep standing your ground, and we'll see you in the very next story.